For the week 6 and 7 reflection for chapter 5, I took a look at the spotlight article as well as the reflection questions that were presented in the weekly outline and kind of reflected on both of those. So, first, I want to take a look at assessments for, of, and as learning within my own practice. And so, for example, assessments that I use for learning um, are generally formative assessments that I um, give, whether they're a quick formative assessment quiz or not, I don't even like to call it a quiz, but just a quick exercise so I can gauge how students are learning and continue to modify my instruction based upon the knowledge that they have of the unit that we're working on. So that's what I use. I use, like I said, the formative assessments as assessments for learning. Assessments of learning, I I'll get into that one in a second. And then assessments as learning are for performance-based assessments. I actually use that mostly for the writing and speaking portions of for foreign language anyway, for Spanish. And really, I just use I have a rubric involved, and I ask students to do a timed write. So they will be asked to write for 10 minutes and just write down as much as they can remember about whatever topic it is that we're working on. And for some students, the first few times we do the exercise, it's very intimidating. They feel like they have a mental block, and they tell me, oh, I couldn't do this in English, let alone do it in Spanish. And I said, well, initially, just if you think of a word, then write the word down. If you think of a phrase, then write the phrase down. And the goal is to eventually build up to a certain number of words in 10 minutes. So, in that kind of gauges, that is a range for each level. So, obviously, Spanish 4 would be writing more in 10 minutes than Spanish 2, for example. So that is what I use for assessments as learning, and the same kind of goes with speaking pieces as well. They're pretty much measured in the same way as a performance based, and along with a rubric, and that's pretty much how that goes. And then my favorite assessments of learning ties into the Spotlight article that I read. And it's a topic that really, it just feels like an ice pick to my heart sometimes. There is the standardized testing that I watch our students go through on a, sometimes quarterly, sometimes, um, every semester, once a semester. Basis, and it's really painful, honestly, to watch. And this right here, this article says it all. It's a snapshot of what students are really doing, and I don't feel like it's a valid measurement. I know students need to be measured in some way, in a kind of standardized kind of way, that every student is measured on the same. It's not subjective. It's they're measured in an objective way. But these assessments, I mean, kids, the anxiety level that I see, sometimes, I'm asked to administer the NOEAs, and I also I proctor the SATs as well. And just the level of anxiety that I see students have and ramping up um, to the assessment. And if they, are taking too long for the NOEAs, for example, If they're taking too long, they're getting anxious, and if their peers are getting done before them, they're getting anxious, and just the mindset that they're being pulled out of regular classroom instruction. So they're not only missing their regular classroom instruction, but now they're missing it for something that they don't even find beneficial. They're not taking anything away from this learning experience from testing, besides that it's making them really frustrated. And they get really excited if they get a score past their benchmark, but then get really down on themselves um, if they don't meet their benchmark. And our school does a really good job at goal setting, but it still really doesn't really have a positive impact for students who really feel like these standardized assessments are not effective for them. And as an educator, I really despise them myself. But I know that some type of standardized testing needs to be done, or formal testing needs to be done that is, like I said, is objective. But it's very, very difficult to be an educator and watch these students go through these experiences. And so that kind of ties into that piece. And then moving down to the formative assessments go digital, I actually really like this article, because for myself, I actually, any type of summative assessment is a paper copy, but I tend to use Google Forms often for formative assessments because they're much quicker, and their students aren't speaking or writing for a formative assessment usually. So I do tend to use a digital platform for that. So it was interesting for me to see what was going on in the article as well. And then kind of just to tie into some of the other questions that were posed, in terms of where do I feel like I fall in measuring my student learning. I had talked about that, and whether or not I have the right balance. I don't know the answer to that, honestly. I feel like I do. I think if I asked my students that, many of them would say that it's a good balance. I don't do standardized testing for foreign language, but I do give midterms and final exams. So they're, really heavy summative assessments. So, I think that is a fair balance, and it is something, I think it's fair because it is something that is preparing students for what they would experience in the college setting as well. And again, getting back to whether or not the school or district is balanced, I think that not only our district and our school, but all as many districts as I know that administer standardized testing, I don't think they're balanced. I think that taking students out of their regular classroom setting, I think the article here said, I believe it said it's a total of 4 months, 12 years of schooling, that adds up to 4 months in a young person's life. And that's a really large amount of educational time that students could actually be spent learning, that rather than measuring to the extent that we are. And so I feel like, getting back to that question, that our district is but not only our district, I think that districts all across the country, in addition to ours, is not balanced in that sense. And I think that's where the education system is flawed, in my opinion. So hopefully someday that will be resolved. And I use learning data to inform my own instruction because, for me, obviously, if certain types of assessments, like if certain formative assessments are working, then I continue using them. But if I find them ineffective, For example, I do like Google Forms because it is a quick formative assessment in a digital space, and it's easy to collect scores and collect data and see trends on, um, measuring certain questions, like how many students got question 3 wrong, or how many students got question 15 correct. And it really kind of helps break down, um, each of the questions for me. So I do tend to lean toward, um, the digital space, but really, I mean, any type of data that I can collect, even perceptual data that I can collect um, you know, from administering any type of assessment, is really, I take that and, even having a conversation with students, like what did you, um, find easier? I have students do a reflection on at the end of each quarter, um, on their strengths, their challenges, something that was easier than expected for them, or more difficult than expected, and something they could put more effort into. So that feedback for me is actually, it's beneficial for them to reflect on it, but it's beneficial for me to gather that information and realize, okay, maybe maybe this type of assessment is not working well, because that seems to be a trend amongst, a lot of these students. So I can still do a summative assessment, but maybe I need to change a couple things around in terms of how or what I include in it, or how I administer it. Um, and the same goes for formative assessments. So I do use that type of data to drive my own instruction, especially in the assessment aspect.